Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Jazakumullah khairan to everybody so much for joining us. One of the Islamic studies teachers at my kids' school always says Jazakumullah khairan so much. And I just love that connection of both, you know, the Arabic dua and the so much right there. We are so happy to have you all join us to discuss what is an absolutely critical conversation and issue, racism in Islamic schools. And we have an esteemed group of panelists. Alhamdulillah, we are so blessed and honored to have you all join us. Thank you so much to all of the educators who are joining us, many school leaders, many teachers, many concerned parents and volunteers. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you recognizing how critical this conversation is, inshallah. So jazakumullah khairan. I am Sister Shaza Khan. I am the Executive Director of the Islamic Schools League of America. I'm so honored to have this position to be able to serve and support Islamic schools and to be able to provide the kind of dialogue and the platform for this dialogue that we know we all have needed for a long time. Briefly, Islamic Schools League of America has been around for 20 years, more than 20 years. It was co-founded by Karen Keyworth and Judy Umri and led by Karen Keyworth until she passed away about 3.5 years ago. May Allah be pleased with her. And ISLA has always focused on supporting Islamic education through networking educators, providing resources that can bolster the efficiency of your schools, disseminating knowledge, nurturing leadership, and carrying out research. We invite you guys to check out more. Inshallah, we'll have the website sent to you guys in a follow-up email, or you can check it out at www.theisla.org. Without wasting too much time, I'd like to pass the mic over to my dear colleague, board member, Rasha Al-Hagan, who is our tech support here, and she has some norms and some fun polls for us to just get a sense of who's out there right now.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So this is a little different than what you would normally used to. Those of you who come to the weekly admin meetings, which is, you know, just a Zoom style where you could see everybody. This is more of a, this is a webinar style. So you'll notice your videos and your mic are not operational. So the panelists, you can see them and you'll hear them. We would like to point out that there are two buttons at the bottom of your screen. One is for chat, and I noticed a lot of you already started introducing yourself. That's great. Introduce yourself, your name, your school, your role in your school. As far as asking questions from the panelists, we would love for you to use the Q&A feature for you to ask questions. So go ahead and use that right there as the panelists are speaking, or if you have any questions ahead of time, please make sure that you use the Q&A panel, the Q&A feature at the bottom. And we will go through those and answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Rasha. Jazakallah khair. So do you want to go ahead and start the poll, Sister Rasha?
Okay, sure. We can start the first question, which you'll all be getting a poll that says, what is your role, your primary role at your Islamic school? If you could take a minute and just fill that out. And while they're doing that, Shaza, feel free to
yeah, well, yeah, let me take this minute to also just really quickly introduce this topic. I know that you guys have joined, of course, you know. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to stream on Facebook because there's some settings that I'll need to adjust. We'll see if we can get that going later on. But racism in Islamic schools, you know, this is something that we all would like to feel or believe that it's not an issue. But this current moment, I think, behooves us to really consider if that is truly the case, and in what ways is it happening overtly or insidiously. Inshallah, I would actually like to get back into why we decided to do this. That I realized actually that I forgot to start with Allah's name and then just having those technical issues. So let me just backtrack just a little and start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All praise is due to Allah, our creator who created us in all different tribes and nationalities and colors and the beautiful skins and different ways that we see each other, our many abilities. Why? So that way we may get to know one another. We ask Allah to bless us as we've gathered here to learn more about the ways in which we as humans have not held true to the principle and to the teachings that you have given us, Ya Rabbal Alameen. We ask you to help us and guide us, to guide our tongue and to guide our hearts, and to give us the courage to realize and recognize the biases and the mistakes and the shortcomings that we all have as your creation, humans. And we ask you to help us to recognize that so that we may start to own up to these shortcomings, so that we may start to be part of the solution of a problem that has ravaged humankind for centuries, if not millennia. Ya Rabbal Alameen, we ask you to send your choicest blessings onto the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who you bestowed upon us, all of humanity, as a mercy to mankind and as a guide and as a real role model that we all can look to, even in today's day and age. Of course, in today's day and age, we ask you again to guide our tongues, to guide our hearts, to purify our intentions, to make us sincere and to make us amongst those who establish justice, even if it is against our own selves. Ya Rabbal Alameen, to fight against injustice, even if it is against our own selves, and to establish justice in this world. Ya Rabbal Alameen, please bless our panelists and all of our attendees and all those who will later join and watch this, and to bless all of the work that we do with Islamic schools and Islamic education. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inshallah, may Allah accept that dua and add your own du'as to that in your own hearts, inshallah. We've gotten some responses to our poll. We've got about half of our participants right now. Mashallah, we've got 72 participants who've now joined. Many more who will be coming on. 47%, about half of them who are administrators and half who are teachers. And we've got some of our concerned parents out here too, and staff members. And inshallah, we hope that this conversation will be really beneficial to you. So in talking about racism in Islamic schools, we'll move to the next poll, inshallah. And we want to ask you, have you ever personally experienced or seen others experience racism or racial bias in your Islamic school? And we put the maybe in there just in case if you're like, well, I'm not sure if that's racism, you know, like, we'll talk about that too. Like, what is racism? All right.
Okay.
So we got it over. Yes, go ahead, brother.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
Imam,
so,
go ahead.
Bismillah.
Go for it, Imam. We wanted to introduce you though.
Okay.
So Imam Jihad, well, let me quickly go in. Imam Jihad has something to say about this, so we don't want to hold him up too long. Imam Jihad, mashallah, is here as a panelist. He is the director of Islah Academy, doing some amazing work with his community in LA. Islah, he is the president of Islah LA, which includes Islah Academy, and was a speaker at our Islah Leadership Retreat this past year with a riveting presentation about the work that he does in his community with restorative justice, mashallah. Before we pass the mic to him, we'd also like to introduce Sister Quran Shakir. Sister Quran, do you mind saying salam so that we see your face? It's not just me.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Sister Quran. Sister Quran was a former principal of the Mohammed Schools of Atlanta, a large network, mashallah, that she continues to remain active in, and is the founder of the United Islamic Schools of Atlanta. She poignantly shared with me that we Islamic schools are not the competition of one another. We should be working with each other and collaborating, and we're grateful for her to join us. We've got our dear sister Sabria Mills, who is all over the place. Mashallah, every single one of these panelists is. Where do we start? She is the founder and executive director of Muslim Advocates for Children with Exceptionalities. She is a former teacher and I believe RTI specialist at a full-time Islamic school in Atlanta. And she also hosts her own podcast called Dope Muslim Podcast. I didn't know dope was a word again, Sister Sabria. You want to say salam?
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It is. In the Urban Dictionary, it means excellent, to live an excellent life. So, mashallah.
All right. I remember.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Wa alaikum assalam. I remember engaging that lingo in the 90s. So I just loved seeing it back out there. And with a sister like Sabria, you knew it was cool to say it. So.
Oh, mashallah.
We got Brother Habeeb Quadri, mashallah, superintendent of MCC Academy, mashallah, recipient of the National Distinguished Principal Award in 2019. Also leads a coalition of private schools in Illinois. And mashallah, we know you all hold and wear many hats. Imam Jihad, without further ado, we see that the polls are showing 53% have personally experienced or seen others experience racism or racial bias in our Islamic schools. We're going a little out of order, but we'll let you speak because we don't want to hold you up. We'll jump back to Sister Patricia after that with a definition of racism.
Okay. So Bismillah. So what I have is, my daughter's experience. So my daughter, she is very light, like we say, light-skinned it, but she's very light. But she has thicker hair, so she's experienced, she has a few experiences, so what she's experienced, I think at Islah Academy, which is at this moment 100% African-American, she's experienced a lot of colorism, and the things like that we've heard, for example, from the male students, we've heard things, for example, I don't want to marry a black woman because black women are too mean, right? I want to marry a white woman. One just straight out said, I want a white woman. And from some of the female children, African-American female children, they've said things like, I want a light-skinned husband because of the hair texture, so stuff like that. I've heard, for example, I was walking one day and I heard someone, call my daughter a white girl. And then she responds back with colorism, that we had to have a long conversation about. She, from I think a group of girls called the young man burnt toast, so on and so forth. And that's existing in this very racialized environment. Her experiences in going to Islamic school, my wife had to bring a book, that addresses the different races and everything else, because they were having an issue in her classroom with one of the students who, my daughter, she didn't experience it as much, but it was one of the students who was a dark-skinned African-American male. He experienced colorism. Also, there was a young Indian girl. She experienced colorism. I'll never forget, at my daughter's graduation, they set the young dark-skinned male, he was set next to a young girl, I think of Arab descent, and the grandmother was behind us and said, why did they sit this, why did they sit the black one next to her? So you have, that generation, we have an older generation in the Muslim community that there's a lot of racism, in that particular group. I think that what happens is that when the children, they hear a lot of racism from the parents, a lot of colorism and racism from the parents, and I think that's on both sides. So some of the experiences that I've heard from young children who ended up switching to our school at Islah Academy so they can be around more African-American children. I've heard, for example, one where there's a fascination almost with the African-American hair, with the curls and the kinks in the African-American texture of hair. There's a lot of comments in regards to that. And one of the children, they said, well, he's intelligent, but one of the students says, but he's black, you know, he's intelligent, but he's black. So those are small instances of racism. A lot of our parents ended up switching and coming to our school after going to a school not too far that was, you know, mainly out up in Daisy, because of the environments at these particular schools. So they wanted an experience where they had, you know, they were surrounded more around people who more so look like them. Black people, when they go into those environments, there's a hypersensitivity already, you know, so they feel they're on their toes waiting for a racialized moment, you know. So, and it may not be necessarily race, you know, the intention may not be racism. However, there's already a hypersensitivity when we go into, you know, those environments.
So Imam Jihad, you know, that sets us up nicely, and I'll follow up by asking you to, if you could just talk a little bit about colorism, but I want to introduce my sister, Dr. Patricia Salahuddin. Sister, Dr. Patricia, can you just give your salam so we see you?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Dr. Patricia is the vice chair of the Islamic Schools League of America. We are blessed with her leadership and many years of experience as a teacher, as a leader, and administrator in many different capacities, holding board leadership in 2 major national organizations, our own, as well as ISLA, as well as the Clara Mohammed schools. Dr. Patricia has a definition of racism that she would like to share that you see right here on the screen. Go ahead, Dr. Patricia, and we've got the next quote in the next slide as well.
Okay, all right, thank you, Dr. Shaza, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is truly a very important topic, and I thank Shaza for making it happen, for facilitating this. We pray to Allah that He will guide us as we move through this conversation, and that we all benefit from the conversation. And based on what we've heard so far, there's a lot to talk about. But first I want to define racism, the concept that's the focus of our attention this afternoon, is the belief that races have distinctive cultural characteristics determined by hereditary factors, and that this endows some races with an intrinsic superiority over others. It is an abusive or aggressive behavior towards members of another race on the basis of such a belief. Now that definition is from dictionary.com, and I have, in addition to that, from a blogger, his name is Scott Woods, who also defines, give his definition of racism. This is an excerpt, it's not a complete thing, so I get his name, so if you want to look it up and see the whole thing, you'll have that opportunity to do that. The problem is that white people see racism as conscious hate, when racism is bigger than that. Racism is a complex system of social and political levers and pulleys set up generations ago to continue working on the behalf of whites at other people's expense. Now, the question is, I would like all of our viewers to think about, what is our role in the system? Do we actively perpetuate racism? Are we complicit bystanders? Or are we advocates for justice? And these are the questions we want to ask ourselves. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Patricia, for setting that foundation. The other thing that I think is important to bring up, especially in light of that last quote, which is really important, because while the definition provided by dictionary.com really positions racism as an individual thing, the next quote by Scott Woods really shares that this is part of a larger context. However, I think that what happens in the larger discourse is that there's a lot of framing of racism around Black and white dichotomies or binaries. And Imam Jihad, something that you brought up brings up the colorist element that might be a legacy of racism. But the other part that I felt was really important for us to address in terms of especially having this discussion right now is that when we talk about racism with other Muslim educators, I mean, this happened very recently, and it's not to call anyone out or to say that they're ill-intended, but that there isn't the understanding that racism, what we're talking about right now, isn't the same thing as xenophobia and Islamophobia. So in particular, in this conversation today, we are focused on anti-Black racism, which is part of that system of levers and pulleys that Dr. Patricia just mentioned. Brother Jihad, Imam Jihad, would you mind just quickly maybe thinking about, could you on the fly tell us a definition of colorist versus racist definition?
Yeah, okay. Well, in regards to colorism, it's dealing with skin tone, so it's and there's in this society, because of racism also, you have a color hierarchy, that exists in this society. I know in the African American community, they had historically the brown paper bag test, and these things, they still exist within the community. And I think that this is a big issue. For example, when we think about in some cultures, they use the skin lightener, and this is a big product in in Africa and India, and because the world, you have a global color hierarchy, but you also have one that's more local, which exists right here in America. So as far as a very technical definition, like you said, it's on the fly, but I'm sure, maybe one of our other speakers can speak more to it.
Well, I want to just, when you talk about, and thank you for doing this, number one, to you, I want to just congratulate you and really applaud you for doing this. And Imam Jihad, it resonated with me when you were talking about the experience of your daughter, because I've seen that too. And, in our community and being a chocolate sister, then I've seen a number of things, but one of the things that a saying that my mother told me about that I didn't really experience because I came through the Nation of Islam where it was reverse racism for us. And so it was, if you're white, you all right. If you yellow, you mellow. If you brown, stick around. If you Black, get back. And that was a popular saying. And that was one of the things that ripped through our community that also caused division amongst us.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Sister Sabria.
Just for a second.
We can't. There you go.
Mashallah. You can hear me? Okay. So mashallah, I think, Jazakallah khairan, thank you to both the esteemed panelists for mentioning that. I think it's a very important dialogue around colorism, and I think those issues need to be discussed. But I do think, just framing it for the time that we're in right now, I think it is really important for us to focus in on institutionalized racism and, the structural barriers against Black people in this country. Because when we talk about the institution of an Islamic school, that also is an institution that could potentially benefit from the structures that are put in place that marginalize some communities. So structural barriers against our people, include, economic barriers, the disparities that exist within education systems, those type of things, healthcare, housing, the systemic levels of racism that go back generations, which obviously contribute to colorism, of course, but you got to look at the root of where it starts at. And when we talk about have we experienced any racism in Islamic schools, we really have to look at it in a systemic way. And I think it's really just important for us to be really clear. How do we discipline our children of color? Our children of color that may express themselves differently as a result of intergenerational trauma. How do we acknowledge that? Is their culture incorporated in the schools? Which is most important, where do we start, is the erasure of Black people in our Islamic studies classes, right? Like, are we addressing those issues? How do we teach Islamic studies, right? How do we honor and give life to people beyond Bilal, Mashallah, as I learned in recent years of the amount of Black people around the Sahabas and Sahabiyats. So I think when we talk about that, I think it's really important, because one of the things I think just around this time that's extremely important is that we are careful about not diminishing the very specific experiences of Black people that came to this country that are subjected and marginalized due to very intentional institutionalized racism. So I just wanted to just add that point in as we frame the discussion.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair, Sister Sabria. What you speak to is echoed in one of the questions that we received, or it's maybe more of a statement, but this is a systemic issue that perpetuates in classrooms and curriculum. Most Islamic schools follow public school curriculums with added on Islamic and Arabic studies courses that typically portray the only figures of Muslims of African descent as Bilal radiallahu anhu and Hajar, both around the premises of being slaves. I mean,
I wanted to say, just, real briefly, some of the things that kind of, really agitated me when my daughter, being in a Muslim school, she comes back repeating, like, for example, what I learned coming up is in 1492, Columbus discovered the ocean blue. And I couldn't believe my daughter's repeating this, and she goes to a Muslim school. And then, during Thanksgiving, she's coming back with feathers. And I absolutely couldn't believe that this same narrative is being perpetuated in a private Muslim school. And I think that there needs to be a deliberate veering away from this racialized narrative that has impacted the self-esteem of many people in the public school. That there needs to be a deliberate veering away from the Muslim schools when they have the opportunity to really dictate their own curriculum.
And so since we're talking about curriculum, and I hear you when you say many of us imitate the public school curriculum, I want us to be clear and understand the purpose of education. And so that's one of the conversations we often have with our administrators and our teachers, is that education has a 4-tier purpose. And most of the time, the public school curriculum has only a 2-tier. And we may have those 2, but the other 4 are important, especially when we're talking about this subject today. So that tier would be that in education, a child should learn intellectual development. So they should learn something that is going to grow them intellectually. In a school system, a child should learn skill development. And that's clear in the public school system. Now, when you come to our schools, in an Islamic school, they should learn Islamic and Quranic development. And that should not just be a class that they take, it should be a part of the culture and a part of every class. So in English, they learn Quran in English, not just in Quranic studies, and not just in Islamic studies, not just in those classes where it's designated for that, but in Islamic school, they should learn Islamic and Quranic development. The 4th thing that they should learn is what is called criticality, where they are able to analyze and look at literature, look at the world, look at things and see who has the power, and to see how they are depicted in that. That's the 4th tier. And so we have to ask in our institutions, are we meeting those 4 levels or not? And if we're not, then we need to begin to revamp, because just duplicating the public school system and slapping an ayat on it is not going to make it an Islamic institution. So we have, as Sister Sabria said, a systemic process that needs to happen.
You're absolutely right, Sister Quran, that, you know, there has to be a analysis of how we are, how we've established our schools and what the structure is and what makes our Islamic schools unique. I love the four-leveled, four-tiered framework that you've outlined for us.
And I don't want to take credit for it. That's from Dr. Goldie Muhammad's book, which is called Cultivating Genius. And I was planning to talk more about that later when we start talking about how we establish the culture of our institutions and how it is depicted.
So absolutely, and inshallah, would love for you to get into that some more. So we want to establish then that there is anti-Black racism in our Islamic schools. You know, that we haven't heard one of our panelists speak about it yet, but you know, Sister Quran, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about this statement that you shared with me, and Imam Jihad also alluded to it, just to really establish this fact that there is both that overt element and then there is the systemic element. And if we're not conscious of either of them, then we're going to be perpetuating something along the line. So Sister Quran, you wrote to me, you shared with me that children come to your school feeling broken from other Islamic schools led by people of other races and ethnicities. They have shared some examples of racism, and you end up having to spend special time over a length of time to help them feel empowered again, being in their beautiful brown skin. Can you expand on that a little bit, just so that we can establish that element first and then move to the structural levels that you guys have started to allude to?
Yeah, so we have mentioned that sometimes in our schools, there are overt and covert ways that we promote certain things. And so some of the covert, meaning is underhanded things, is that we may ignore or overlook or not talk directly at a student, and that causes them to feel like they're not important. Imam W.D. Muhammad said, a sense of self makes living better. And so I'm often talking to our students about this sense of self. So I ask our educators to examine your halls, your schools, the literature that you're using. When a child goes into your institution, how do they see themselves in that institution? Is there anyone looking like them hanging from a wall or in the books they're studying? And not just the Islamic studies. I have to keep saying that because sometimes we'll say, well, we talked about Bilal ibn Rabah, as Sister Sabria said, but who do they see in the literature they're reading? What faces do they see? And often when I'm designing, I have a hard time when I look up the word Muslim and I look for an image. It's hard to find somebody who's melanated. And most of the time, it is someone who doesn't look like us, and they need to see someone who looks like them to have that sense of self. In addition to what they read in the literature and what they see on the walls, then it's the discussions that they're having. And a lot of times when we start to tell our story, as our dear brother talked about, you know, we tell the story that America has given us. But also the other thing that happens is that the story of the African-American child is told from the time they got on the slave ship. And they don't hear about the majesty and the magic that they have that came long, thousands of years before they got on that slave ship. And I often tell our children that one of the reasons that the conqueror came to get those people from Africa, and they did not go to Africa and get slaves. I often tell them that they did not go to Africa and get slaves. They went to Africa and got scientists. They got astronomers. They got physicists. They got people who were big and doing things and enslaved them. So the language is important for us to note too. And so when I tell them this story, we have a history that did not begin with enslavement. And too many times we tell the story from a position of pain and hurt and struggle, but it's a bigger picture than that. And I think all of that contributes to that broken feeling that the children come like, I'm not worth anything. And they'll say those kinds of things. So when they're in the classroom and I'm calling on them, me, because they're so used to being overlooked. Like, yes, you, I want to hear your voice.
So what I hear is that, you know, racism, the perpetuation of these racist ideologies is embedded within the curriculum that we've just kind of picked up. And also the ways in which that we are, you know, omitting, as Sister Sabria also mentioned. Sister Sabria, I've heard the word trauma used a lot recently, and I'm sure that it was being said before. Not all of us were listening. May Allah allow us to hear and listen. Can you tell me a little bit about the trauma that that you have heard or had to, you know, work with youth because of the ways in which that they have been treated in Islamic schools in particular? Sister Sabria?
Yes, can you hear me?
Now we hear you.
Okay, alhamdulillah. So when we look at trauma, you know, we look at it as it's defined loosely as a deeply disturbing event. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, you're talking about something that began years ago. It begins in utero when individuals are in the womb. It happens prior to the generation. It impacts the ways that individuals within a family understand, cope with, and heal from trauma. So when you talk about, you know, our Black people here and Black children, and right now I currently work as a consultant. I work in the public school sphere, but I go between different schools, and usually they're in economically challenged communities. And I work with primarily 100% children that would be considered children of trauma. But when you look at that, you really look at, you have to. So this speaks to something I think that often is not discussed in Islamic schools, which is the equity piece, equity in education. And I think that if we move away from this idea of, you know, treating everybody equal and the same, that's kind of out of like, that's sort of out of the conversation at this point in time, because you already have a group of people that are 400 years of oppression and of barriers against them, that is just impossible to put them, these children into the classroom and talk about, okay, we're going to treat you, you know, Bilal the same as, you know, Johnny. It's just not practical. So when we look at equity, that needs to be more the conversation in our Islamic schools, because it's like, what do our children need? Like, right? So children that are perhaps, so like, for example, if I go into a classroom, I may get children that may all of a sudden be showing me an attitude of like what could be considered defiance, right? But as Sister Quran spoke to, what has been that child's experience? Has that child been silenced? Does that child see themselves within that curriculum, within that space? I'm going to give you a quick statistic. Black students in this country represent only 15% of the total United States student enrollment, but they make up 35% of students suspended once, 44% of students suspended more than once, and 36% of students expelled. And this speaks to, like, when we talk about George Floyd, this speaks to the criminalization of Black individuals that happen when children are young. It starts right there, the school to prison pipeline, right? You're going to talk, you know, and so when we speak about trauma, we speak about that, how the funneling into special education of our children, you know, this rising epidemic of calling all of our kids, you know, oppositional defiant, and even calling our kids having attention, you know, disorders and things like that. You know, a lot of it is the trauma that they experience going into these schools and being marginalized and being punished and penalized, being misunderstood and unheard. So one of the things, like I said, when I deal aggressively with children of trauma is you take the whole disciplinarian thing out of it. You don't even start there. You know, you start with aggressive love and acceptance. You start with aggressive love and acceptance. You start with allowing them to see themselves as they are, as beautiful human beings, right? And even if, and usually they come and they immediately, you know, want to attack me, because that's just the defense. But I give a ridiculous amount of love before we even talk about discipline. And I think that that's really essential and important, that we understand equity. Every child, you can't give them the same thing. Some children need a little bit more. Some children need a little bit more because of their experiences and how the system has set them up to already fail. So just something to think about in our schools.
And our attendee, Sister Medina, says, you know that that's not defiance, rather they are misunderstood and placed in a negative box, labeled, treated poorly, and stereotyped. And as you mentioned, Sister Sabria, this isn't just in the public schools, this is across school systems, and disproportionately felt and done to our Black brothers and sisters. Brother Habeeb, it's not like you to be so quiet. I would like to.
I am listening. I'm listening, but no. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I just wanted to, you know, for us, you know, alhamdulillah, having the opportunity to be in the public school then, and also in Islamic school, and then, you know, visiting about 50, 60 Islamic schools in the United States. Look, we have to, especially as administrators who are non-Black, have to realize that we have done not a good job in really advocating for the situation that our Black brothers and sisters are going through. In our Islamic schools, there is going to be some racism. There is stereotyping. There is biases or prejudice. A lot of times we just kind of like, okay, no, Islamic schools can't have racism. No. Stereotyping, biases, prejudice, and what we have to look at, and it could be from something small microaggressions to even big microaggressions, something even like language. When we have, sometimes it might not be this, it could be this from the student side, it could be from the parents, sometimes administration, our community, our parents. Where you have a school maybe where there's a majority population of Middle Eastern, where I've heard individuals visiting, I was speaking to students where they would say that, hey, you know what, I've heard the word abid, right? Which means a slave, and use it, and some of the kids like, well, I didn't know it was bad, my parents use it, right? So that is a problem. Or from a Southeast Asian, the word kaldu, right? You know, where, and to be used, it could be used in a very derogatory way. And so I think this idea from language to even the way we, in the seatings in our buildings, from the way that could be disciplined to the curriculum. And I think, may Allah bless Sister Quran for reminding us that a lot of times, yes, the idea, it can't just be like, well, you know, I taught it once, but understanding not just in February, Black History Month, and doing one day, but realizing that the Afro-American history is only benefited especially all the immigrants who have lived here, no doubt about it. You know, and I think they have to kind of understand it. And when you understand the historical things from Mansa Musa, the Mali Empire, the Ghana Empire, and understanding all these other significant things that have only manifested throughout history of the greatness of Islamic education and philosophy, because what happens is that we have to realize and make sure our kids, from the demographics, from our parenting, that we have to do all the things that we have to be more advocate and play a part in reevaluating our curriculum. And that's why I didn't want to speak a lot, because I want to hear today. I really want to listen from these other three distinguished panelists. But I think I just want to reiterate that, you know, may Allah bless Islah for bringing this topic up. And I think we need to really kind of go ahead and make some reevaluations. Things are happening. We cannot just be on the sideline, or we're like, oh, we've done some steps. No, we have to do better. And it is something that, you know, it's sad it's taking something like this for us to realize. And I think even especially for the immigrant population, you know, earlier I had a few weeks ago wrote a piece, and I think a lot of times, even as immigrants, we're like, oh, we went through struggles. Don't even try to compare, right? And I think that's something that we have to realize, that no, what the 400 years is nothing to coming in 1965 under the Immigration Act, and thank you, Martin Luther King Jr., for making that even happen, and then giving an opportunity to go and to come in as with scholarships to universities, or getting the opportunity to go to universities, is not even the same playing field, and there's no way we could compare that. And that's where I think this is where we as educators and administrators really need to go back in this fall and look at what we can do better, and we need to do better. And may Allah bless Sister Quran, Sister Sabria, and Imam Jihad. And you know, and that's why I'm going to be not talking too much. I'm going to be listening, and inshallah ta'ala, if there's, you know, if there's something I could add, I will, inshallah. And I think that's there. And then the last thing I just want to say is that for Islamic schools, we have caught ourselves too much with the ibadat. When we look at fiqh books, only 1/4 of it is really you and Allah. 3/4 is dealing with other people. And sometimes we get so caught up on the salah, no doubt about it. Salah, fasting, all those are important. But until we teach our kids how to act with each other, behave with each other, and the whole, the akhlaq and character of what we're supposed to do in the tarbiyah, and we have fallen apart and have not done that good of a job. If our Prophet ﷺ, the last words or last sermon was, it reminds us about the racial issue that can happen, and Prophet ﷺ reminded us, and we have to do a better job. So With that, I won't talk anymore.
No, well, we wanted to do that, Brother Habeeb. Jazakallah khair. Of course, I think that it's really important for us to hear from a leader who is of immigrant or children of immigrant descent, to be able to acknowledge that and to speak to that, because sometimes that's what it's needed. It's looking in the mirror and hearing it from, you know, from that perspective. So we really appreciate you sharing that. And
can I respond to something that Sabria said?
Of course.
When she talked about discipline, and I think this is important not just for the African American child, but for all of our children as Muslims. When we talk about revamping and restructuring our curriculum, I have been on this bandwagon of all of us making the Quran the source of our curriculum, not the resource. And that's a big difference. So, you know, some of us use like, oh, I'm going to teach this standard. Let me go see what the Quran says. Instead of starting with what does Allah say, and now let me see how I can weave this standard into it. So begin with the Quran as the source. But when we think about discipline, I'm often talking with our educators about when we are ready, a child has erred. And I say, let's look at how Allah corrected Adam. Let's go to the Quran and see how Allah addresses certain challenges that come to us. So when those challenges come from our children, it's not new. Allah has already addressed it in the Quran. So let's go to what Allah has given us and use that. And then the other thing we tend to be is punitive. I'm going to punish you. Well, that punitive means I mean to hurt you, to make you do right. And so I say, no, let's look at corrective measures. What can we do that's going to correct that behavior? And then that's going to force us to do what Sabria said, to offer a little love, because maybe that child just needs a hug and they just acting out they're doing negative things to get attention. So to really look at how do we offer corrective measures for all of our children. So then we're not so much suspending and doing all of that. We're doing some unique things in this process here of correcting our children and evolving them and using the example that Allah has given us in his book.
So I think that it's important. So the entire community right now needs a reorientation. You know, for example, I just met with imams who were so nervous about, in California, we had a day of outrage in which we demanded, the African-American community demanded that everyone give a khutbah condemning police brutality and also anti-Black racism. And the imams were nervous over this. I mean, they came to me asking, is certain ahadith appropriate? How should they use this? So what I found out is that there needs to be a reorientation, because within our khutbahs, our sermons, we have these microaggressions. We have this, visible, implicit bias within our sermons. I think it's important that our environments, all of our environments, I mean, when you have the school environment, it mimics the masjid environment that it's attached to usually. Amen. So, because one thing that I found out is that the same training we have to offer the teachers, we have to also, and the students, we have to also offer it for the people who attend the masjid. Their parents are attending the masjid. We do restorative justice. We started at the school and realized the adults, these are just, the adults are the teachers of the students in this type of behavior. So we need that same type of training in the masjid. So what I'm saying is, with the teachers, for example, I know without training, I made some mistakes as a teacher, you know, not knowing how to deal with, for instance, a child who is traumatized. One of the young ladies, she felt some type of way. Her father had not called her in months, and she sees me interacting with my daughter. So that impacted her behavior within the classroom. And all I knew was the punitive reaction, you know, on how to deal with that. And what you see is that when you have untrained teachers, it leads to the criminalization of these groups. It leads to the criminalization of Black boys usually, and Black girls with these punitive measures, who they go into the environments already with, you know, some of the research that we've done is behind some of the theories, like, for example, stereotype threat. Stereotype threat, it poses, there was a test done on a group of African-American students, and it says because of the stereotype, even a stereotype that says that Black people are not smarter than the other groups, they're not as smart as the other groups, just having that stereotype causes an impairment, right, to a person's efficiency. And it really gets in the way of a person's competence. And they found out that this causes a distraction. It gets in the way, it narrows their focus when they're taking a test. It causes anxiety. It leads to a person withdrawing their effort. It also, you know, it causes a person to overcompensate and overstudy. You know, so when we look at these things, our environments need to be psychological needs supportive environments. Some of the research says that the psychological needs are, for example, one being competence. If I'm in an environment and I'm impaired by stereotype threat, I don't feel competent, right? If I'm in an environment and the group that I belong to is looked at as sinful, right, as criminals and thugs, I do not feel competent in that environment. If I'm in an environment where the teacher targets me unintentionally, but targets me because of the stereotype that she's been fed or he's been fed, then I don't feel competent. And then also you have, so we have to, our children have to feel competent. This goes back to the Quran. For example, in the Quran, you have Surah Al-Qadr, where Allah says that this night of power is worth more than a thousand months of worship, right? This is for the underdog in the Islamic environment who felt, I can't compete with others who are doing all this good. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, hey, look at this. I got this for you to propel you past them in your relationship with me. You know, so we look at these things, Surah Al-Ikhlas. It gives the people who, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, can you recite the Quran? Can you recite a third of the Quran in the night? And they like, how can we compete? He says, well, just recite this. This is a third of the Quran. You know, so we have competence. And then there's another piece, relatedness. If you have, in every environment, there's identity verifiers, ones who approve behavior. If I'm in an environment and I already come in with a deficit, I already come into an environment where I don't have the support, I don't have the approval that is needed, I'm ignored. You know, one of the things attached to being Black is being invisible, right? If I'm in an environment and I feel ignored, I'm not getting my psychological needs met. I'm in a group right now, and my ideas are always thrown out the window, right?
Yes.
My psychological need of relatedness is not being fulfilled, right? So I'm going to get up out of the group. I'm not going to leave right now, but it causes stress.
We validate your thoughts. Inshallah, next time we'll be speaking to him. By the way, he will be Dr. Imam Jihad Saafir. So we're excited about that too. But really some important research that you're sharing here to contextualize and really understand like the psychological element of, and the conscious work that needs to be done at every single level. We have, I can't believe that we're already at the top of the hour and we only have about 30 minutes left. So as much as I want to comment, I know I have to zip that and try and allow our, our participants to be able to have their questions or comments read and commented on and reflected on by you guys. Sister Afifa Abdurrahman says, that's an excellent point, that we need to work with students, teachers, parents, and others in the community. Guys, nobody said it was going to be easy, right? Like, it's not just the staff, it's not just the board, it's not just the students, it's also the community, because that change won't happen unless if we're dealing with all of those levels. Otherwise, the work done with students to help shift behaviors and norms to be more equitable will not be supported at home and in other places in the community. Another question that has been raised repeatedly is about how do we handle the denial within our non-Black admin teachers and parents that there is racism or microaggressions in our school settings. Brother Habeeb, is that something, I know you don't want to talk, but I want to bring you out and have you reflect on that. How have you ever had to deal with that, a denial from admin teachers or parents that racism or microaggressions are real? And how do you deal with that?
I think one thing is we need to kind of call out stuff. And I think a lot of times we're like, oh, no, that we didn't mean it that way. We're Muslims. And, you know, Islam is perfect. Allah, the Prophet, is the most perfect person. We as Muslims does not mean we're perfect. We have mistakes and we need to separate. You know, a lot of people throw out, Islam is beautiful. Islam is, I'm like, that's right, it is. But we as individuals have not done a great job of it. And I think that that's something that we have to be very careful in there. So I think what we have to do is start calling out. And that means, see, a lot of times, and I think having this training, and that's why even this summer we're looking into, you know, sometimes we do diversity training, but I think a lot of times we, especially immigrants, have to start opening our minds to say, hey, what you say this or what you don't say is also could be taken as a prejudice, bias, or racist. And I think that's something that we're going to have to educate. And then when we have a conversation with parents and kind of understanding, and a lot of times, even though I know it's those things, no, I didn't mean it this way, or my child didn't mean it this way, or we say that as a joke at home. No, that's unacceptable. And we have to call it out. And there has to be also discipline, because what happens, the child who is the victim, it's like, oh yeah, they let it go. Oh no, he didn't mean it that way. That's because their family uses that word term. He wasn't meaning like, you know, like it's not like the, you know, a harsh, no, that person, you said something that's derogatory or use a word that's there, and here's the consequences for that. So that way the child knows like, hey, we're not just being heard, but we are also trying to make adjustments and trying to make things better, but then also looking at what programming. I think the big key right now is to really think about our programming that we are doing in our curriculum and looking at that. So it does happen. I mean, you can't, there's no possible way. If anyone says, no, it doesn't happen at our school, I'm sorry, then you're just lying to each other. And it can happen in the same way, just like even in your own community. Colorism is another whole thing, right? Indo-Pak, Fair and Lovely, that's a product that's very popular in India, right? And skin toning and so on and so forth. So it's not there, and it comes in various ways. It could be done in ways that people don't even realize they're doing it. So, but we have, you know, with students and stuff that we've had to, you know, kind of have discussions with, and then also looking at it. I mean, one of the big things 7-8 years ago, we're in Chicago. Mashallah, this year we did our demographics. We have 46 different countries. But 6-7 years ago, we did a reevaluation. Like, wait a minute, why is the population one specific ethnicity group? And so there was a big push to really go out and say, well, let's open our, our community, making sure equity, giving opportunities, scholarships, whatever. There's all these things, and having that, taking steps and looking at it at various levels, right? Even from our staffing, right? We're 100 staff. We had to look at like, so now alhamdulillah, we're 29 different countries. But again, is there things like that doesn't mean, oh, I feel good, I have 26 countries. But what about African Americans, right? So that's another kind of discussion. So these are things that we have to kind of look at and say, look, we're just making steps, and we can't say we're doing that. Mashallah, we do this. That's why, but no, these are things for us to reevaluate, but that should be it.
So this leads to, and I want to point this one to Imam Jihad, because somebody also, Sister Yelena, asked about restorative justice, which is the topic that you had talked about at the ISLA retreat. But I want you to frame it, if you could, around a different question that was also asked, was how do we deal with tension or conflict between Black and non-Black faculty? So we've talked about calling it out when it's students or even if it's staff. I mean, we've even had instances, of course, in Islamic schools at every single level where a board member might be using anti-Black racist terminology and harboring those feelings, and they're a board member. So how do we, could you talk about that maybe in the framework of restorative justice, or just generally speaking?
Yeah, I think it's important. The Muslim community, we're somewhat experts at avoidance. So we don't really we become experts at this. So what we found out is that so for example, some of the experiences that we've had as far as, African American Muslims. I've had, for example, some of the members come in and say, I went to a certain masjid, and while I'm praying, a sister comes and covers my neck. Or while I'm praying, someone moves my hands. Or my friend says he went into the masjid and the person started telling them how to perform wudu. And he was given a khutbah that day. He said, thank you. And then he got up and gave the khutbah. So this idea of really trying to make each other clones of each other, instead of really beginning to accept each other for our individual selves, and I think that it's important for when we come into these environments, even as teachers, to circle up and people be given the opportunity, a non-judgmental space, right? Low expressivity. We love, like we say, we love to express even without words. If we hear something we don't like, so I think that, training people to really be able to listen to the other side, listen to each other's story, backing away from this idea that I believe, and this goes to that stereotype, I believe you may be a new Muslim, so I'm going to start teaching you. And I don't even know your name. I don't even know where you're from. So getting the community, and what we find is that when we teach the parents, the students begin to benefit. When we teach the students, the parents begin to benefit. One group has to be taught. And then, hopefully, like a lot of times we find out that the students began teaching the parents. You're going to have a lot when you teach about race relations and racial formation to the students. They'll go home and tell their parents, hey, that's not appropriate. That's no longer appropriate. You can't say those things. So I think that it's important sitting down, people down, and getting to know each other's story, learning to listen to one another. This has to be the culture of the masjid, has to be the culture of the Muslim school amongst the teachers and also the students.
Can I just add on to that, Shaza? Because you said something really important about school culture. So anytime a school is designed, school culture is extremely intentional. There's a lot of resources and intentionality that goes into how you structure or frame your school culture. So it's one thing to just say, okay, this is who we are, and have this expectation, this broad sort of vague expectation, but it's another thing to have a very intentional, clear message of what your school culture is. And that always starts from the top. So, I know I spoke of this as an uncomfortable discussion, but it's like, mashallah, we, how our boards are organized, like how our leadership is sort of organized. Do you have representation from the community that you serve? Do you have input, constant input from the community that you serve? Are we only, is our leadership just from a specific, maybe elite group of individuals that are like economically on the upper scale? Because another thing is that we have to also be very intentional of looking at, we know that our private institutions have to be funded through private tuition, but it's so the more that we drive up these costs, we are marginalizing communities like Black and brown people from economically disadvantaged community. We are marginalized in a sense where they don't have access to these institutions. So although I know it has to be there to finance our institutions, we still have to be very intentional about making other plans, and so that we can offer, like additional scholarships, or we can start to drive down our costs so that more people can access, so it can be, equitable for everyone to access Islamic education.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask a question? And I don't know if this would be geared towards the teachers, whatever, but I really want to know, how did the parents or how did the teachers respond to even this George Floyd situation? Even before that, how did they respond to Trayvon Martin? What we see is some of the studies, they have a whole stage framework in regards to, they call it negressence or negrescence. And this is the stage, what happens when a person encounters white racism, when they have, this was a huge event. I've looked at my friends and I've compared them to this stage. All of my friends, we're angry. We have, it's created some type of distress within us in our speech. Our speech has changed since watching George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And we're going through a stage, we need the community to, this is a very sensitive moment for us. How did the Muslim schools respond when these huge events occurred? Normalized teaching has to stop, and this has to be dealt with amongst the students. So I'm curious on that.
Please, brothers and sisters, feel free to use the chat to respond to Imam Jihad's question. You know, Imam Jihad, I mean, I thank you for bringing that up, because we didn't start by mentioning these tragedies that happen on such a large scale that we know have been happening, as you mentioned, without much public outrage, and that this was the tipping point, as I've read and seen, you know. So we are interested also to hear what you guys have done in the chat. Just to speak in terms of the Islamic Schools League of America, we've also asked our Islamic schools to participate in the call that you put out, Imam Jihad, and that the leadership put out for taking a clear stance against racism and police brutality, and having some actionable items that we will hold each other accountable to. And inshallah, that the Islamic Schools League of America continues to try and facilitate these discussions, as well as some really specific training, anti-racist training, because we know that, you know, the discussion is the beginning. It needs to continue. We're all learning. So, you know, and absolutely whatever we're doing, we need to be doing more and better, inshallah.
Shaza,
Yes.
may I add something?
Of course.
One of the things that I think we have to remember as Muslims is that Allah does not change our conditions until we change what's in our heart. And each one of us has the responsibility to change what's in our hearts. And we, as a community, school, community, we will not grow. We will not be successful. We will still have the same problems unless each one of us change what is in our hearts. And there are people who want to, and I think that's where the training comes in. When you're about to talk about the training, I think we rely on the world to train us. We rely on other institutions to train us. But when we get to our schools, when the people come into our school, it is our responsibility to train them to the way we need for them to be trained, and to do the things that we need for them to do for our children, for all of our children. Because not only does it benefit the child, the African-American child that's in that room, that's being included, and the curriculum is also including his interests, or addressing some of his issues or his interests or his concerns. It also helps the other children as well. We're all helped. It benefits everybody. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of training first ourselves, working on me. I got to work on me, you have to work on you. And then we also have to look at what can the training that takes place in our children, in our schools, how do we reorient ourselves? How do we train ourselves to be the best school that we can be, and to be the school that is exemplary of the life of a Muslim and exemplary of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, that is as he is left as an example for us.
And I just added a link to Dr. Patricia's article in the chat, inshallah, where she's elucidated on these points of both the internal and the external work that we as Islamic school educators need to do. Jazakumullah khairan so much, Dr. Patricia, for your, that really excellent and important needed reminder. Sister Sabria has mentioned equity a couple times, and access is another element that is part of, another thing that I was thinking about, and equity and access in particular, reflects on the intersectionality of race and socioeconomic status. So that's another element that we need to look at, is not just the one thing in isolation where we're like, oh, well, we're dealing with racism. Well, we need to also look at classism, because that is clearly a very strong issue in our Islamic schools, in particular, the way that they're structured, where we need funding. And a lot of times the way that you see the board members selected, and it might not be the case, inshallah, for all schools, and is that, you know, they're the top contributors, and so now they get the most say in how the school is run. Well, is that fair? You know, and does that further the Islamic principles of and the reasons, the foundation for which we've created these Islamic schools? So I wanted to share with you guys and just reflect back, please, panelists, with me on this. I've heard many Islamic schools say, well, you know what, we're trying to deal with access. We've got a scholarship fund. We do our Ramadan fundraising. We've got this, but you know what? And I've mentioned, I've actually said it directly to leaders, is like, well, why are you guys touting these scholarship funds for refugee students, for example, and not, for example, Black students or anybody who needs it, right? Like, my point is that the emphasis is always on that back home overseas student versus somebody who's here in the United States. And like, so what do we, how can that be responded to when it's like, the response is, well, they don't apply. You know, we've got an open financial aid system. It's a blind financial aid system, blind review. If they meet these criteria, they get it, but they just don't apply. Or like, well, yeah, our Islamic school doesn't have a lot of African-American students. And we all know, right, that if African-Americans constitute 30%, if not more, of the American Muslim population, which Islamic schools do we see where they're led by non-Black leaders, where they are constituting 30% of our student population? So when we bring these topics up, we just hear, well, they're not applying. They can apply. What do we say to that? What are your thoughts on that? Anyone?
Well, just in response to the they're not applying, I would say a part of the reason that they're not applying is because of what we've been talking about today. They don't feel welcomed, and they don't want to go into another space where they're going to be disrespected, disregarded, and all of that comes with that. So that's a part of it, is that they may not be applying because they don't think that's a place for them.
Okay, so back to that point about culture and representation, Sister Quran.
And that's, yeah, I mean, that's the reality, is that, you know, no one wants to send their child into a place that's just going to, you know, place upon them all type of complexes. You know, I think that, you know, if we have these environments, you know, we have to make sure that you know, without that training, I mean, if for example, if we have teachers who are still saying that race doesn't matter, and you know, color doesn't matter, I don't see color, then that's problematic. You know, so we have to really see what are the ideas and the worldviews of our teachers. You know, because I mean, for example, I've had teachers. Because the reality is, when we come, we may be from one land, right? Which is full of tribalism. And that tribalism in America looks like a very nasty racism, right? And they may not even see it. It's very deeply embedded in the structures of the lands that people are coming from. You know, so they bring that type of behavior. They bring that type of worldview into the school environments, and they give our children complexes. I mean, we have to, at Islah Academy, we have to give major training to our teachers who have migrated over here. They have to undergo major training in order to be able to teach, you know, our children. You know, even this idea of always saying something is haram. You know, this also can be racialized. You know, especially when it's constantly brought up to a certain group. This is haram, and the teacher feels that I need to always emphasize this because I believe that this group is always guilty of this, you know. So that, I think that extends, that's an extension of racism and what we view as halal and haram, you know, and people, a lot of times we don't look at that.
So we're close to the end. I've got a question that I want to ask, and then I would like to end by asking, well, I've got a few questions I really want to ask, but I don't want to hold you guys up. So I'm going to ask a couple of them together. This has kind of been addressed, but I want to bring it up because this is a student who raised this question. I just want to even if we don't get to respond to it immediately, to hear a student share this. She emailed this question to me. As a Black Muslim student raised in different Islamic schools in South Florida, I and other Black Muslim students have seen that most of the overt and subtle racism comes from the educators themselves, who are uninterested in creating an anti-racist environment for their Black students. How can Islamic schools begin qualifying and selecting their educators better? So that's our dear sister, who has now graduated from a few different, she attended a few different Islamic schools in South Florida. We also have a comment or a question from a sister, a participant, who said, my school has many Black students from the inner city. As a white teacher, I have tried to stress to them that the N-word with a hard R or an A at the end is never appropriate for school. I'm a history teacher, so I will only use the word in a historical context, and even then I call it the N-word. What is the correct answer? The kids say that they are taking back the word. Please help this, quote, old white lady Karen understand.
I'll start with, I have that challenge also because the majority of our students are African American and they call each other those names. And so I take it off of me and I say to them, go to the Quran, Surah 49, Ayat 13, or it's either 11 or 13 because I use both of those interchangeably. And I'll have the students sit in a corner, read it. I'll watch them as they're reading it. And I'm going on with class. And then I'll come back and say, can you read it to the class? And it's the one that says, it's the ayat that says that be careful of calling each other by offensive nicknames.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that again, and they'll say it. And I said, and who said it? And they'll say, Allah. And I say, it's not me. So I'm just saying. And then I'll say, go on, what does it say? And it says, and if you don't stop, then there's a punishment for you. So I say to them, all right, students, the onus is on you now. I have given you the word of Allah, and leave it there. And if they say it again, I call the surah and the number, and soon they start doing it too in class, reminding each other. And we had this discussion once with them, and I know we're getting toward the end, but we had this discussion once with them. Why do you do this? And they say, it's the music we listen to, and it's the videos we do, and it's acceptable. And so we have to teach them that we are trendsetters by the grace of our book, by the grace of the word of Allah. We're trendsetters, and we don't follow the world. We don't follow what they do. And we might like certain things, but we have to always have that criticality where we are analyzing, where's this power and what is this doing for us? Mm-hmm. And then teaching them from that perspective. Mm-hmm. So my dear, what you say, old white teacher, mm-hmm. Mashallah.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. I know that as a teacher, Islamic studies teacher, I was unsure of how to address the same issue when I had a student say it and use the N-word and, said, well, that's what the other kids are saying too. So I really like that, very practical. Sometimes we know something is wrong, but we don't know the right way to address it when, especially you do have somebody commenting that they're trying to take back the word. And that is, a popularly held and affirmed position. And one more comment that I want to read, and then we'll go around and do some closing action items, I guess is what I want to call them. But this is a really good point that a lot of us, Sister Jennifer Webster states that a lot of us from a certain generation were taught that referencing an individual's color is racism. This was in response to the racist language that was used in the past. For some of us, being colorblind is what we were taught after the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it's not meant to be an insult. Anybody want to make a 2-minute comment on that? Or a 1 minute, 60-second comment? On why it's important to actually like in this instance, when we're talking about anti-racist work, is it important for us to identify color? Is being colorblind okay?
No, well, even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he recognizes color. He says, I created, you know, from the signs, you know, we marvel at each other's, the different complexions that, you know, Allah has, you know, placed before us. So Allah has, he is mentioned in one particular ayat, he's mentioned in Surah Rum, he mentions that, you know, from the signs, he's created our different languages and our colors, right? And so this is from the signs that we marvel in regards to Allah's creation. And we appreciate each other because of the different complexions. We don't demean each other. So I think that also Allah mentions the different colors in the animals in the Quran. He has an ayah where he mentions the different colors in the mountains. So I think the color thing is we have to teach each other how to appreciate each other's color. And if for example, if we had, I know me, if I just had green food on my plate all the time, it would drive me, it would start impairing me psychologically. So I think that all of us, you know, if we were to see one color all the time, we would get bored. So I think it's really orientating the students towards appreciation, towards appreciating others' opinions, the diversity of views, the diversity of the experiences. And that's why it's important to really teach the students. You know, they have a paradigm, the nonviolent communication, in which you learn, what we've been taught is how to really activate each other's ego defense systems. This is how we've been taught. Muslim community, we know how to insult, we know how to demean, but we don't know how to really cause a person's guard to drop. And this is what we have to teach: compassion, and you know, a lot more about compassion and love. And I'm a Black man. I'm proud to be a Black man, and I want you to see me as a Black man. And I want you to appreciate it.
Sister Shaza, can I just say something really quick? Can I add on to him?
Yes, of course.
Really quickly. So I also think, coming from the lens of being not seeing color, and is also in a way, it's sort of diminishing what's really happening in the world, right? We as Muslims, we are supposed to be fighters against oppression, right? I always say that the Prophet Mohammed, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was engaged in conscious struggle. Mashallah, he had the best character, and he came to, you know, empower and uplift all of us. But he was, he was a fighter against oppression, and that's something that we have to do. So to say we don't see colors, almost diminishing the experiences of what's really happening. If you're in this country, especially if you've immigrated here, you have to still take some sort of look. And what I'd say is we all have to clean up our own house, right? But we have to take some sort of look. Do you benefit, right? Do you benefit from a system that has been designed to marginalize people of color, right? Or to marginalize poor people, Black people here in this country. And so it's about taking that look and being aware, so that when things like this happen, right, where our brother George Floyd is brutalized in broad daylight, you know, suffocated, subhanallah, you know, like, we're not so unaware, we're not so shocked, we're not so kind of taken aback, because we are conscious people, and we're very heightened and aware of what's happening to our Muslim brothers and sisters, and we're actively involved and engaged with them in the struggle against oppression.
And I just want to add to that is that if we look at ourselves as a part of Allah's creation, and we take an orange and an apple, or a daisy and a rose, and we'll say, is the daisy better than the rose? And when you describe the daisy in comparison to the rose, are we not going to say something about the color of those? Are we not going to say something about the color of the orange and the apple? So those are Allah's creation. I always say Allah loves diversity, and that's why he made all of us like this. He made us different. And he said he did that for a reason, so that we can get to know each other. So let's do that, and not put all the emphasis on what's different, but let's put the emphasis on the beauty. And you got to talk about the color, because it's a part of the beauty.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sister Nadia also says that saying that you don't see color is a manifestation of privilege. You may have good intentions, but being colorblind ignores the reality that Black students face every day. I think that's really important.
They mentioned one more thing. You know, they mentioned, and that's the white privilege of this land, is that like, for example, you can see an advertisement of a movie that may say you know, a cop, you know, takes back his city or something. And that's referring, when you just say a cop or a police, that's referring to a white police. But usually in the advertisements, a black police officer and him and his partner, blah, you know, so they compare advertisements. That's definitely privilege in this land. And when you don't mention race, that's one of the you know, the features of racial privilege in this land is going when your race goes unnoticed.
White privilege and also model minority privilege, you know, if I could just throw that in there. Yeah. And privilege manifests itself in different ways in different institutions. And I think that that's, you know, the point of this conversation also is that in Islamic institutions, who is being privileged and what is that? So we've talked about the different racial and ethnic backgrounds, the cultural backgrounds that receive a lot more privilege. And we've also had a few different comments about colorist, you know, the lighter skin, even within a race, and also class, which has intersectionality with race and ethnicity. And so this is a lot, guys. This is a lot. You know, this is just, hopefully it's not even the beginning. Hopefully this is something that we've all been thinking about and reflecting on, if not before, at least upon the gruesome and public murder of our brother George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others. But this is one webinar. Inshallah, we plan to have many more, you know, similar, talking about racism and establishing justice within our Islamic schools, being authentic to our mission and the duty that we have to Allah and to His creation, inshallah. We would like you guys to stay connected. In particular, if you're an Islamic school educator or leader, sign up to join our email discussion group. You can find that at www.theisla.org/IECN. IECN is for Islamic Educator Communication Network. Check us out on theisla.org. Inshallah, we are working on having more professional development and training on anti-racist education for Islamic school educators so that we can talk about the unique ways in which racism manifests itself in Islamic schools in particular, as well as unrelated to, you know, anti-racist work, but still something that you guys might want to keep your eye out for is upcoming online professional development. The foremost of which we will be providing is on hybrid learning design, inshallah. Brothers and sisters, before we end, I would like to ask each of you to just, watching the clock, give us one thing that Islamic school leaders or teachers, knowing that that's what our audience is primarily comprised of, what is one thing that they can start doing right now to address this issue of racism in Islamic schools? We'll start with Sister Sabria.
Start from the beginning in your text and the way that you teach.
Sister Sabria, can you say that again? Your voice.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum. Sorry. I would say start at the beginning and ensuring that you reevaluate your curriculum and reevaluate how you represent Blackness in our Islamic history texts. Our children need to see themselves, and honestly, it's about also reporting factual history. It's also about that. So I think just starting there, that's a good point, and also be very conscious of your school culture. So from the top, you know, reevaluate how your board is structured, how you're hiring your administration, how you're hiring your staff members. I think that's extremely important because we haven't even addressed, you know, like, you know, the experiences of like Black teachers, or even the hiring process, the promotion process, and all of that as well. So just reevaluating school culture and the structures and policies that you have in place.
And this is the right time to be doing it, especially with the summer. Let's take advantage of this time and use what we're learning right now and reflecting on, inshallah, to inform that reevaluation. Jazakallah khair, Sister Sabria. Sister Quran, one takeaway, one thing that Islamic school educators and leaders can do right now.
I echo what Sister Sabria said, because I think it's important for students to see themselves depicted in curriculum, depicted in the halls, depicted in the literature. that we are selecting for them. And I also posted, but it looks like it only went to the panelists. I posted 2 pieces of literature that would be beneficial to our educators to look at as we include more of the African American and the African story in our curriculum and evaluate the curriculum itself. And so one book is Cultivating Genius by Dr. Goldie Mohammed, where she actually has lesson plans and she has the evaluation tool for your own lessons that you may have. Also, Dr. Patara Ravs has literature and workbooks and other information on his website at sproutingeducation.com, which I think could benefit us if we all start to reevaluate the curriculum itself and how we present our young people in their voices being seen in how we tell the story.
Jazakallah khair, and we'll definitely make sure that we add that in an email with resources to our participants afterwards. Thank you so much, Sister Quran. Brother Habeeb, one thing that educators and teachers can start doing right now.
I would just say, as what Sister Sabria and Sister Quran had talked about, training curriculum, and especially for us for immigrants, anyone non-Black, we need to do our own self re-evaluation, reassessments of our own selves, of our own racism, stereotypes, biases, prejudice, just to do that, so before we even do the school, we need to look at our own selves and say, so that way we could set ourselves up to make sure we make the right change.
Thank you so much. Imam Jihad, I leave this with you so that you can also conclude with a dua, inshallah, to leave us off. Sister Patricia, if you have something else to say, please jump in before we conclude completely.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Shaza. I would like to just add to Brother Habeeb's statement of the self-evaluation. I think that's very important. We should make an effort, if you are a leader, a school leader, get sensitivity training, anti-racism training for your school, for your staff before you start school this year. If we get that and to just benefit from that, then the other things will fall into place. And that's one of the things I think is most important, is to clear that heart clear our own hearts and work on that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patricia. And thank you so much for your leadership. We're so grateful to you and for all the work that you do behind the scenes. Jazakumullah khairan so much. Imam Jihad, we let you take the mic at the end. Give us one thing for our leaders and teachers, and then please conclude with a dua.
Okay. One thing that I think is important to realize is that the Quran, the revelation, made some adjustments depending on where it was revealed to. So for example, the revelation in Medina that was sent down in Medina is distinct from the revelation that was sent down in Mecca. So the same thing, be careful of blindly importing techniques that may have worked back home into this environment, and understand that this environment, for 90% of America's history, there has either been, race or slavery for most of those years, and legalized segregation. The rest is what they call de facto segregation. So when we talk about 400 years of oppression, 90% was oppression written on the books with slavery and also segregation. So that means 90% of the land that you are living in has experienced racism. One of the sayings that we say is that the alcoholic beverage is slavery that got America drunk, right? And America still hung over from the alcoholic beverage, from the intoxicant, which was slavery and segregation. So you're in a land that there's still money here from slavery. So there definitely still is the psychological impact here from slavery. So adjust your teachings, realize the land that you're in, make necessary adjustments. Inshallah, we need to build the necessary mechanisms to train the teachers. We don't participate as Muslims in the cancel culture. We don't want to cancel any of us. All of us are valuable. We need one another. If I've heard something that's racist from my fellow Muslim, it's okay. There's a day to make tawbah. You make tawbah, there's a day to change. but we have to be open now to make those adjustments in this world so we can be that model community that Allah wants us to be. So with that, I would definitely say thank you for the invitation here. I think my colleagues, this has been a very beautiful discussion. I think we need about 10 more months of this discussion, maybe every week, to really do some justice to it. But I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring our hearts together in love. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to see us as family members of one another. Ya Rab, O Lord of everything in existence, creator, khaliq kulli shay, creator of everything in existence, Rabbul Alameen, Lord of the worlds, we ask you to purify our hearts. We ask you to purify our hearts of racism. We ask you to allow us to overcome the disease of arrogance and ignorance. We ask you, Ya Rab, to allow us to move towards community life. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr.
Ameen.
Jazakumullah khair, and thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Taking a look at your questions and anything that wasn't answered, inshallah, we'll give a best shot to reply, but definitely we'll be sending you guys a recording as well as the resources, inshallah, at least some resources, and we'll keep this conversation going, so stay in touch. Thank you so much, Sister Sabria, Dr. Patricia, Brother Habeeb, Imam Jihad, Sister Quran, and every single one of you guys who have joined us to recognize this huge responsibility. Jazakumullah khair, may Allah accept it from us. Assalamu alaikum.
Ameen, ameen, ameen. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.